Good morning, friends. Thank you for tuning in to Holocaust Museum's Facebook Live. My name is Agnes Schwartz, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. And I hope you're having a cup of coffee with me and enjoying yourself while you sit back. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end, but please send the questions, and when my talk is over, we will get back and try to answer as many questions as possible. I was born in 1933 in a small Eastern European country called Hungary, and I was born in its capital, Budapest. My parents were married for 8 years before I came along. They wanted a child very much. And the story went when I was a little girl that my daddy was so happy to get a little girl that he gave the doctor an extra $100. Whether that's true or not, I really don't know, but it certainly sounded good to me as a child. My early childhood could not have been any better. I wish every child could have a life like I had. My parents must have been relatively affluent because we vacationed on beautiful Lake Balaton in the summertime and in the ski chalets of the Kékes Mountains in the wintertime. My mother and father ran a store whereby they sold yard goods to tailors who made custom-made clothes. So my mom being a working woman, we had a live-in housekeeper. Her name was Julia. Julia and I became very attached to each other because she was truly a second mother. And besides cleaning house and cooking delicious meals, she took me to the park and played with me. And she just became a member of the household. Now, my father's side of I didn't have any family. My paternal grandmother died 2 weeks after I was born. But my mother had a set of parents, so I had a set of grandparents. And they lived in a small town called Rákosliget, about an hour's train ride from Budapest. I loved to spend time with grandma and grandpa. They raised ducks and geese and chickens and planted wonderful vegetables, and the aroma from the fruit trees was absolutely delicious. Grandma was an old-fashioned housewife, and she cooked delicious meals, and my parents came every weekend to join us for Sunday dinner. My mother also had a sister in Hungary, and she was married but childless, so Elsa, her sister, became another mother to me. I loved Elsa dearly. She was married but was childless, and she and her husband took me to all kinds of places. One time I remember there was a carnival they across the street on the parkway from me, and they bought me a Cupid doll. And my life in general, I'm telling you all this so you can compare it with what had come later. My mother, even before I started going to school, started to impress upon me that I had to do very well in school because there was a law called numerus clausus, whereby only 1% of a college class could go to a university. My mom had 2 more sisters. There were 4 freedmen girls altogether. And they had immigrated to the United States way before I was born. Her older sister, Etta, was a physician. And I think Mom would have liked me to walk in Etta's footsteps. When it was time to go to school, I was enrolled in a Catholic girls' school. I have no idea why. I can give you a good guess that probably it was the best education in the area, or it was safer to send a Jewish child to a Catholic school. I don't know. Now I have nobody left to answer any questions for me. At this school, There were several other Jewish little girls also, but every morning, since it was Catholic school, we were taught catechism for a half an hour. And then a teacher came in to teach our Jewish children our religion a couple of times a week. I felt absolutely no anti-Semitism at the school. But after school, the Catholic kids had their friends and the Jewish kids had their friends, and we never mixed and matched after that. Now, the school system in Hungary was such that you went to school for 4 years and then you graduated, and then it depended on your grades whether you can go into a gymnasium, which was a college preparatory school of 8 years, or if your grades were only so-so, then you went to a polgari, which was another 4 years, and you learned a trade so you could go out in the world and make a living. One day I came home from school and I said to my parents, there's a funny looking flag in front of one of the buildings as I go to school. I couldn't understand it because I knew what the Hungarian flag looked like, and this was nothing like it. So they explained to me that that was the headquarters of the Hungarian Nazi Party, the Arrow Cross. And of course, there was a big swastika on the flag. And that was truly my first acquaintance with the swastika. My parents kept the war very quiet and away from me, not to scare the child. And when they listened to the radio, it was never in my presence. So I was really totally, I knew there was a war, but I had no idea who was fighting who. So I graduated now and I did pretty well in school, and my mom and I went to look at the school door where there was a sign posted listing who made it into the gymnasium. And tears of joy rolled down my mother's face as she read my name. So her hard work with me accomplished what she wanted. And now I went on to the Jewish gymnasium. By this time, the Allies were bombing, but almost always in the dark of night. And the area sirens would go off, and we would grab some warm clothes. And I lived in a 3-story apartment building with lots of apartments, and we all headed for the basement. And the place shook. But as a 10-year-old, I couldn't quite understand why everybody looked so frightened. Our building was not hit any of the times we went through this. And then when the all clear signal came on, I went back upstairs, got undressed, got into bed, and in the morning, like nothing had happened, I got dressed and my parents got dressed and they went off to work and I went off to school. And this continued in this fashion until March 1944, where the Germans crossed the border and took over Hungary. And then everything changed for the Hungarian Jews. My mother's 2 sisters in America tried to urge my parents to immigrate for many, many years. My father always said, Jews have never had it so good in Hungary. I have a well-going business and we don't want to leave the rest of the family. Well, this was all right until March 1944, when, as I said, the Germans marched into Hungary, and the Hungarian people, most of them, were extremely happy to see them. Hungary was in a depression, and the Hungarian people were promised Jews property and money and jobs. So unfortunately, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and there still is in Hungary. Within a matter of 60 days, as soon as the Germans came in, I had to start wearing a yellow star. And anybody, even little babies, had to wear a yellow star. My grandparents lived in a small town, as I told you, and my parents must have heard of some atrocities out in the outlying areas, and so they decided to move Grandma and Grandpa in with us. Fear was etched on everybody's face, and you know, this COVID virus very much reminds me of that time when I couldn't go to school and my parents couldn't go to work, and we couldn't go to the grocery store. And unfortunately, this virus has brought back all those terrible memories for me. So we lived in our apartment until June, and then we had to move to what they called a Jewish designated or a Yellow Star building, both meaning the same thing. And here we were under much more crowded circumstances. The place was only a couple blocks from where we had lived, but we had to share an apartment with two ladies, an elderly lady and her middle-aged daughter. And there were two bedrooms, and Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, and Dad and I were in one bedroom, and in the other bedroom were the two ladies. Well, the place was crowded, but it wasn't so bad. But after I went to sleep for the first night and I woke up, I was itching terribly all over. The place was infested with bed bugs. And this was a nightly reoccurrence. Every morning I woke up scratching and itching. As a child, to me, this was the worst part of living in that place. My mother was never a cook. She was always a businesswoman. And Grandma was there. Jews were only allowed to go to the store after 4 o'clock. So the products on the grocery shelves were pretty well diminished. But she made do with whatever she could. And she became the cook. And then my grandfather got sick, and he got so sick that we couldn't keep him at home. So the whole family, all of us went and took him to a so-called hospital where there were cots lined up one next to the other, just like in MASH or some old movies you may have, wartime movies you may have seen. And to this day, I don't know what became of Grandpa, whether he died of natural causes, they killed him, they starved him to death. None of us ever heard anything more about him. I still have my mom and my dad and my grandma with me. So I was very lucky. I was one of the few children who was never alone without somebody who I would know would take care of me. And then one day, a troop of Nazis marched into the building, and a gunshot rang out into the air, and they ordered men to line up downstairs, working age men, like 18 through 45. And this included my dad. And of course, the Nazis told many, many lies. But the one that stands out in my mind is the one that they told us that not to worry, they're just taking these people to work and they're coming back. Of course, they had absolutely no intentions of bringing these people back. And my daddy put on his custom-made coat and his boots and his little knapsack and kissed us goodbye. And now he was gone. Well, I was upset enough that my daddy was gone. But then a few days later, the same scenario took place. And this time it was the ladies, which included my mother. And my mom had a beautiful gray Persian lamb coat. And you know, this was November 1944, and the Budapest winters are like harsh Chicago winters. So she put on her fur coat and her boots and her little knapsack, And she stood in front of me. She did her darnest to put a smile on her face in order not to scare me. And she said, like you would say to your children if you went away for a weekend or something, be a good girl, listen to grandma, and I'll see you soon. I was 11 years old, and that's the last time I ever saw my mother. I don't have to tell you how fear crept in on us even more and more. And one day there is a knock at the door, and to our surprise, it is my father. And my daddy tells us the story that he was on a cattle car, like you can see at the museum, not knowing where he was going, and a couple of Nazi officers needed directions to Budapest, and so he became their guide. Well, after he brought them back to, well, that was his lucky day because he spoke a fluent German, and that's why he was chosen as their guide. So now he's at home and he says, where's mom? And grandma and I explained to him what happened. And immediately said, I'm going to go after her. And I, as a little girl, tugged at his jacket. I said, please, please don't leave me. Mommy is gone. And even my grandmother, my mother's mother, said, there's nothing you can do for her. And that was the truth. So my dad did not go at that time. And once again, a few days went by, and once again, there's a knock at the door. And this time it's Julia, our housekeeper, a wonderful, wonderful Catholic lady who risked her life in order to save mine. I have no idea whether she just took it upon herself to pack up and go, or and come and get me, or this was prearranged with my parents. But she came to get me, to take me to her home and hide me. And grandma threw some articles of clothing into a brown paper bag. And off, we took off the yellow star. We marched out of the building, and we got on the streetcar to go to her house. And on the way, she explained to me that we're going to tell the neighbors that I lived in Eastern Hungary, where the Russians were already occupying the country. And my mother and father wanted to send me away from the Russian occupation. So they sent me to my aunt, Julia, in the big city. I took on her last name. I had absolutely no papers. And she warned me that her neighbor, Teresa, was a big Nazi sympathizer, and I had to be very, very careful what I said. So this is the way we lived for a while. Julia had beans and potatoes and smoked meats in her pantry. We may not have had elegant dinners, but I can't tell you I ever starved. There was always something on the table. Can you imagine the burden on an 11-year-old child? That you can't laugh out loud, you can't cry out loud. I'm so sorry for the interruption. It broke my trend of thought. Anyhow, pretty soon, the Allies started bombing, and they were bombing night and day and day and night. And I'm living in a 5-story apartment building, and now everybody has to move to the basement. So all these people pile into the basement. There was a stack of chopped wood where we took blankets and pillows and made ourselves beds, one next to the other. And there was no there was no electricity down there. We lived by candlelight. It was cold. It was damp. You couldn't take your coat off. It was scary. It was absolutely miserable. But above all, there were no toilet facilities, and you have a couple hundred people, and a bucket is passed around, and In the still of the night, the waste is thrown out. And the place becomes very, very smelly in a very quick order. And you either get used to that smell or you go outside and the bombs will kill you. It's a very, very poor choice. Julia would run up in between bombings and grab some food and bring it down. Couldn't even read down there because there was no electricity and the candlelight wasn't bright enough. So she told me all kinds of stories about when I was a baby to keep me amused. Let me remind you once again, had anybody found out that this wonderful lady was harboring a Jewish child, they would have killed her as quick as they would have killed me also. But nobody ever asked me any questions. And this went on from November through the middle of January, when word started spreading from house to house that there was guerrilla warfare in the street and the Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby freeing the Jews. So slowly the bombing stopped and even the machine gun fire abated and it became very still. And finally, we had the nerve to stick our heads out the window and finally opened the door and went out. Well, you've been in a dark basement for hours, for days, and now you go out and there's snow on the ground and it's January and the sun is reflecting off the snow. So you can't see anything, but I could smell, and that smell will never leave my nose. And the only way I can describe that smell was the smell of death. There were dead bodies all over the courtyard of the building. There were dead horses all over the streets, and people were so hungry that they were running out with a carving knife to carve up the horses for a meal. But you know what? The war was over, the threat was over, and we were free. The rest of it was totally immaterial. My head was full of lice. I'm sure everybody was full of lice who was in that basement. And Julie had some kerosene and took care of it, but that was such a minor problem compared to the live and die situation we had just survived. So now the question becomes, who lived or died in my family? And there's no way of communicating. You know, today we all have a cell phone. Well, there was no such thing as a cell phone. Julia didn't even have a house phone, which was not unusual at those days in Hungary. And one day I'm playing out in front of her apartment when I turn around and I see my father walking up towards me. I flew into his arms. I was so happy to see him. Now, my daddy by nature was a very handsome man. He was tall and slender and walked very erectly, and now his skin had a funny pallor to it, and he was bent over and he was skin and bones. And he came in and he explained to us that he survived in a Swedish protected home. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, but he bought up many, many apartment buildings in Budapest and declared to the Nazis that the people he has in there are protected by Swedish law and Sweden will take them when the war is over. Sometimes the Nazis abided by that and left those people alone, and sometimes they didn't. My father, once again, got lucky, and they didn't bother him in there. But food was very scarce, and as he would explain it, there wasn't enough, even room to stretch a leg. So my daddy needed to eat and get well. And he took me, and of course, passenger trains weren't running yet. We got on a freight train, much like the cattle cars. And we got off in a small village. I have no idea what it was called, but he knocked on a farmer's wife, on a farmer's door, and they negotiated something, and they agreed to put us up. And that lady made the most delicious bowl of scrambled eggs that night, because I hadn't as much as seen an egg for God knows how long. So on a farm, there's livestock, there's milk, there's vegetables, there's fruits, and the lady was a good cook. And we slept and we ate and we enjoyed each other's company. And the soccer is Hungary's national sport. So the little town had a soccer team, and my daddy enjoyed the soccer and I enjoyed being with him. So I tagged along and I held his hand while he watched the game. And that's how we passed the time for 2 or 3 weeks until he started to feel better. And then we went back to our old home where we had lived before the Holocaust. And there was a family occupying it. But this was a decent family because most Jews were robbed of all their belongings they left behind, and these people left our belongings intact. As a matter of fact, for a short time, we even shared the apartment with them until they had an opportunity to find other lodgings. So slowly, life took on some normalcy. And my father got his business back. And now deportees are returning on a daily basis, telling terrible, terrible, terrible stories of looking and being very ill. And with every train load, I'm waiting for my mother. I have no idea where she is, but my mommy's coming home to me because my mommy loves me and she wouldn't leave me. I went back to school and I met up with some of my friends, and none of us asked each other, how did you survive? Is your mother alive? Is your father alive? It was a deep, dark secret somewhere that none of us dared to go. But we were back in school and learning, and life was going on. So one day my dad came home from his business and he told me that he found out that the Budapest ghetto was formed a few days after Julia had taken me, and all the other Jews who had not been deported had been pushed into the ghetto. This included my grandma and my uncle and aunt. The war was coming to an end, there's no question about it, but the Hungarian Nazi Party was very, very, very strong. And the Jews weren't dying fast enough for them. So they went to the ghetto and they took 8-10 people and marched them down to the shores of the Danube and wired them together. And with one shot, they sent them all to the bottom of the icy Danube. So please don't tell me about the blue Danube, because that Danube is very, very red with all the blood that was shot into it. What was their sin? They were decent, law-abiding people. Their only sin was that they had been born Jewish. I'm still waiting to hear what happened to my mother. I'm still waiting for her to come home. And then one day my father came home crying from his business and sat me down and told me that a lady came into the store who told him that my mother died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on January the 15th, 1945. I did not believe it. My mommy's coming home to me. No, and I walked the streets looking for her. For a long time, I walked the streets looking for her. Of course, in the meantime, my father had made contact with the American relatives. And around 1942, my parents started taking their offer of immigrating to them seriously, and they started to see a problem. And actually, we had all our papers ready to immigrate in 1942. And in the last, our luggage was already in Lisbon. And in the last minute, the Germans wouldn't give us the visa to go through their country. So had we been able to immigrate at that time, my life would have gone entirely differently. In January 1947, my dad and I took a train to Berlin. We slept in a bombed out hotel, which was nothing unusual because all the buildings were bombed out in Hungary also. And next day, we got on a propeller plane and flew to New York. On the trip, my father told me all kinds of stories. He told me that everybody's rich in America and people don't wash clothes. If it gets dirty, they just throw it out and buy new. The streets were paved with milk and honey. But above all, that my three cousins in America were all boys, and I'd be the only girl, and I'd be the princess. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. On the way to New York, we encountered a terrible storm, and we had to make an emergency landing in Newfoundland, where we were ushered into a beautiful dining room with white tablecloths, and I have no idea what they served. All I can tell you is that I remember seeing ice cubes in a glass. That was my first acquaintance with ice cubes. In Hungary, the iceman brought the ice in big blocks. Nobody put ice in a glass of water. So that was my first impression. And then we got to New York, where my uncle, my mother's younger sister, Betsy's husband, who was a CPA, met us. And we took a train to Chicago. And the dining car and the sleeper were quite an experience that I've never had before. And now I met my new family, my Aunt Betsy and my two cousins, Paul and Tom. Paul was 10 months older than I was, and Tom was a couple of years younger. And they welcomed us. And they had fixed a room for me that was probably a den before, and my father slept on a daybed in the dining room. And then my physician uncle and aunt came over to meet us. And as soon as they heard my father cough, they sent him for a chest x-ray. Well, it turned out that he had tuberculosis. Tuberculosis at that time wasn't as curable as it is today. And off to Winfield Sanitarium, which today is the DuPage County Hospital, he went, and there were no expressways at those days, but his family took me every single Sunday to go see my father, and I could only see him through the glass because children were not allowed inside. They enrolled me in school. I should have been in the 8th grade, but because of the language problem, I was in 3rd grade, and yes, I had some English lessons in school in Hungary, but they were nothing like the spoken English. I was totally at a loss. My math and my science knowledge and Latin were way ahead of the American kids, but I couldn't speak the language. So they promoted me from the 3rd grade to the 4th grade. as I became more fluent with the language. And by 1 semester after had I been born here, I graduated grammar school. By that time, I knew enough English to go to high school. And I even made a little speech on the podium. About the same time, my father was finally pronounced negative, and now my daddy's coming home to me. And you know, this house that I'm living in, they tell me that they love me, but how do I know that they love me? The family who loved me and I was surrounded by all my life is gone. So remember that I was going to be the princess? Well, because I was the only girl, I was asked to set the table and I was asked to wash the dishes. Well, princesses don't do stuff like that. That's not what my daddy promised me. So that was a disappointment to me, yes. But it was a much bigger disappointment that when my daddy was discharged, he said he wanted to go back to Hungary. He couldn't learn the language, he couldn't assimilate, and I was heartbroken. My uncle said if he insisted on going back to Hungary, he would pay his way, but he would no way pay my way to take the child back to the country where they murdered our family. And when I was 14 years old, my father went back to Hungary, and I stayed here, and that's the last time I ever saw my father. I was very bitter about him deserting me. To this day, I can't always make peace with it. I have my days when I say that he suffered terribly emotionally from the war also. And then I have my days when I say, how could you leave your one and only child alone in the country? But I am very grateful to my uncle that he kept me here and they raised me, because at least my children were born American citizens in the land of the free. So now I am going on to high school, and you know, my uncle and aunt and family expected to get a skinny little girl who was starved to death in Europe, and instead they got a chubby child. Well, they sent all kinds of care packages to us. It was full of Hershey bars and cream of mushroom soups, which I particularly liked. And I ate. And when I came to the United States, I was very lonely, and I tried to fill the hole in my heart with the food. And there were no counselors at that time around to help families through this kind of situations. So they put me one diet after the other diet. And of course, I ate when nobody was looking, and I never lost an ounce. And it was a very, very difficult time for me. I made some girlfriends, but I was scared to death to even talk to a boy. My cousin Paul brought home very cute boys, but I was scared to death of them and never, I don't think I even ever said hello to them. And you know, every child is entitled to the unconditional love of parents. And that's what I lost. Yes, I gained a new family, but I was never certain that if I didn't agree with what they asked me to do, would they throw me out or wouldn't they? Now, as I grew older, I knew that they loved me and they took good care of me, but that wasn't the case as a teenager. Teenagers are very fragile, and I had lost so much. My girlfriends were dating and I wasn't. And all of a sudden, I'm a senior in high school. And one of my friends asked me if I want to go on a blind date. I said, sure. Now, meantime, my cousins are going off to college, and secretly I want to go to college too, but I have nobody to tell it to. So I kind of made my own plans. My uncle decided that I should be a secretary, and that's about the last thing in the world I wanted. And I was always interested in the medical profession. So I decided that if I go to nursing school, I could live away from the home where I'm unhappy and learn something. And I actually got a scholarship to Mount Sinai Hospital's nursing school. And along came this blind date. And by golly, there was a boy who liked me. And he liked me so much that he called me next day and the day after, and more often. And he started visiting more often. And for my birthday, July 24th, on my 18th birthday, he gave me a tiny little diamond ring. He wanted to get married. I've known him for all of 6 weeks. Now, my friends were all going off to college, but I was getting married. Well, we did get married the following October. I knew that that was my point of no return to the Kuhn family, but I was happy for the first time since I've come to the United States. I had somebody to love me for myself, not because they were related to me or anything like that, but Danny and I were really, really in love. We were two kids who were unhappy at home, and we found each other. He was 4 years older than I was. And the marriage brought 3 children, and now I had my family. This was my family. Nobody else's but mine. I was very conscious of the fact that I created this family, or I at least helped create this family. And I had 2 boys and a girl, and I was a very, very happy stay-at-home mommy. My husband, unfortunately, never made a good living, but I felt that was coming. And the kids were growing up, and I loved every minute of it. We bought a home right across the street from an elementary school, and Stephen was school age. That's the oldest child. And Danny was an electronic technician, and he taught at the technical school in the evening. And after 13 years of marriage, he started to tell me some strange things. Anyhow, the first thing that I was really aware of that was strange was that I shouldn't say anything on the telephone when he's at work, because the phones were wired. So a story got stranger and stranger, and one day he called me and said he was going to commit suicide and jump off one of the tall buildings, the Prudential building downtown, and I knew I had to get him help. And with his family's help, I got him to the hospital, to Michael Reese Hospital, and where he was admitted and pumped full of drugs. And after about 6 weeks, he did better, and they were talking about discharging him. And I asked for a diagnosis from the doctor, and the doctor said, we don't give diagnosis, we treat symptoms. But I got a hold of a layman's book, and I diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. He was just a classic case, and I told the doctor, and he couldn't deny it. And now, after about 6 weeks, my children are standing in the window waiting for Daddy to come home. And after he gets home, well, he's supposed to take medication. And it's typical of this type of illness. The patient refuses the medication, and then his condition slides. And he was readmitted at Michael Reese a few times. And each time he was pumped full of medication and sent home. Well, it came to the point where his illness became chronic, and my colleagues did not treat chronic mental illnesses, so I had to commit him to Kankakee State Hospital, which is no longer there. And our lives went on like that, and I watched my children be more and more troubled, and their grades were slipping, and we lived in a chaotic house. Then a psychiatrist referred me to the Jewish Federation for supportive therapy. It was the best thing that I could have done for myself, because finally I started to dwell into my past and find out why I did things that I did. And after a couple of years of therapy, I was convinced that the only way I can save my children is to get a divorce. They tested me. They wanted to send me to college. Now somebody wants to send me to college. Now I don't have 4 years. I have to feed 3 kids and myself and put a roof over our heads. So we agreed. I went a year to business college, and with that, I became a very good stenographer, typist, and I got my first job with Wilson and Company. I think I was their only Jewish employee. I was a token Jew. After 15 years, I got a divorce, and I learned that law offices had the best pay scale for secretaries, and I applied to a law office for a job, and I met George Gore, and with a handshake, I had a job which was paying me $10 a week more than the previous job. And so I spent the rest of my working years in law offices and watched my children grow up, and 2 of the 3 graduated college, and the third one was very clever with his hands. And he gave me a lot of problems. My middle child, he missed his father terribly. So he dropped out of high school, and when he felt a need for it, he got his GED, and he grew up to be a very honest, decent man who's worked at some of the largest hotels in the country as maintenance supervisor. So he made himself a life. And the 3 kids gave me 4 grandchildren. All 4 of the grandchildren have graduate degrees. And I am so proud of each and every one of them, and of my own children too, of course. They have given me so much. And they have made my life worthwhile, because for a while there, when Danny got sick, I didn't think life was worth living for. So now I am up in the years, and the COVID virus comes along, and I am living the past again, unfortunately, reliving the past, comparing it with the COVID. And I hope the day will come in my lifetime when I can still go out and do things that I want to do. I can no longer drive because of poor eyesight, and I miss that very much. But my children are all very close to me. I talk to them all the time. And how many grandmothers can say that their grandchildren calls them at least a couple of times a week? So I am a very, very lucky survivor. I am a survivor in every sense of the world, because some people came to America to strike gold, and I came to America to find freedom. And there's nothing more important besides eating and drinking than freedom. Please make sure you go out and vote this coming elections, and teach your children not to discriminate, that we are all created equal, and not to judge by the color of the skin or by the shape of the eyes, but get to know a person. If you don't like them, you don't have to like everybody. but at least give them an opportunity, because that's the only way. You know, anti-Semitism is once again on the rise, and it disturbs me terribly. So I'm a big supporter of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and the United States Holocaust Museum. And I hope you join the Illinois Holocaust Museum next Wednesday, June the 24th at 10 o'clock again, to hear the story of another Holocaust survivor, Estelle Glazer Laughlin, and share her story with her. You've been a great audience. I appreciate talking to you, and God bless you, and let's go forward. Teach your children to not to discriminate, because nobody is born with prejudice. It is taught. God bless you all. Bye-bye.